I'm very glad to be here. Many of you I've spent the weekend with, and I was wondering what to speak about this morning, and Ajahn Somsong reminded me that last time I gave a Sunday morning talk here, I talked about anger, so I thought I might talk about loving kindness instead this time. And just a few minutes ago, at the end of the retreat, as a blessing, I chanted what's called the Buddha's teaching on loving kindness, the Karaniya Metta Sutta, which we chant in English most days in our monasteries in England. And this is one of the most popular and well-loved of the Buddha's teachings. And also it's one of the most understandable and one of the most profound at the same time. Most of you who are here now were here a few minutes ago when I chanted it, and you'll notice that even those of you, say from Thailand, who might know the Pali words, might not have been too familiar with the translation, but you'll notice that in the text of this short teaching, the Buddha is describing a quality of kindness, of affection towards all beings of every kind, the beautiful, the ugly, the kind, the malevolent, those who wish well, those who wish harm, those born, those not yet born, visible, invisible, near, far, of every single kind, all beings. So we're not being discriminative in any way as to who deserves our kindness, who deserves our love and our affection. And this is quite a tall order for most of us as human beings. That we know that we start out having affection for the things that we like best. We can generate affection and kindness towards. But then we start to be a bit more sort of cautious. We don't hand out our affection to the things that we don't like, that we're indifferent to. And then those people and those things that we dislike, we tend to give out our hatred, our annoyance, our anger goes on to such beings, creatures that invade our kitchen, like cockroaches and green fly that eat our roses, people who steal our cars, run off with our car stereos, people who sell drugs to our children. We experience anger, resentment, negativity. But what the Buddha is describing in this short teaching is that even though some creature, some person may act in a harmful or cruel or foolish, selfish way, that is no reason for us to not be kind towards them. Liking something is not the same as being kind. Liking someone is not the same as being kind to them. We can be kind to that which we don't like. In fact, one of the most often quoted teachings of the Buddha on this as well, which usually intimidates the life out of most people, is what's called the Sutra of the Saw, and where the Buddha says, even if you are held down by a gang of bandits, of criminals, and they cut your arms and legs off with a two-handed saw, they cut you into pieces. Anyone who in that situation even held on to a feeling of aversion for a moment, they would not be living according to my teaching. Now you think if you were being cut to pieces by some people, it might be allowable to just have a little bit of negativity, just a kind of touch of annoyance that people are chopping you to pieces. But the Buddha is putting forth an extremely high standard, and this is not just for monks that he's putting this forth, but this is a standard for all human beings. Because what he's saying in this situation is that even with the most painful and difficult, the things that we like least of all, the thing that we would last want in life, like being, and he uses the example of being chopped into pieces, that even that does not justify us acting out of negativity. It does not justify us hating that person. As I was saying during the retreat, when we were having our Dhamma discussion, that there's a very distinct difference between recognizing that something that we do or someone else does is worthy of criticism, is like a foolish thing to do, is foolish for us as a person to do, or it's foolish or selfish or cruel for someone to do. There's a great difference between that, recognizing that as unwholesome, and then hating the person, putting negativity onto the person. As I was saying, it's quite possible for me to, in relationship to anyone else, to say, well, I have tremendous affection for you, and I love you dearly as another human being, but the things that you say are really stupid, or that what you did yesterday was really selfish and unkind and destructive. And one can say that without wanting to hurt the person, or wanting to get at them, or wishing any kind of harm whatsoever. Now, normally in our way of acting, those things are very much mixed up together. That if we're criticizing another person, or we're criticizing ourselves, then we tend to put that criticism onto the whole being. We have that gets mixed up and becomes a negative attitude towards the whole being. But if we want to pursue the spiritual path, we want to develop Buddhist life, it's essential that we recognize the difference between those two, to see that that we can have a quality of metta, of loving kindness, of acceptance, an absence of ill will to all things, to everything, to other people, to ourselves, to all the psychological states, all the states of mind that we experience. That is possible, and that's something that we can directly cultivate. And at the same time, we can recognize the foolish things that we do, habits of mind which are destructive, harmful to ourselves and harmful to other people. We can recognize that was a stupid thing to do, and to undertake not to do it again. That doesn't have to be, we don't have to turn that into self-hatred. Or, as I've been saying, if one recognizes something unwholesome that someone else is doing, that doesn't have to turn into being hatred for them. We can simply recognize, well, that action was selfish, that action was unkind, but there's no need to condemn the whole person. Now, in the West, we tend to be we tend to have a lot of negativity towards ourselves. Again, during the retreat, I mentioned this a few times, but I think it's worth reiterating, and it's something that I tend to bring up a lot when I'm teaching, because it has such a powerful effect on our lives, is that we have such a high standard for ourselves, that especially people who are interested in spiritual development and want to live a good life, want to be good people, and want to develop what is pure and beautiful in our life, in our heart, that as soon as we feel any kind of selfishness or jealousy, as soon as we're small-minded, we get upset about things, we experience greed or lust or any kind of negative state of mind, we become very self-critical. We start to hate ourselves, and that rather than having a quality of metta for our own life, which is when you're practicing the meditation on loving kindness, you always start with yourself first of all. Before you try and send kindness anywhere else, you have to learn how to accept yourself, to have kindness towards ourselves. And then, once we can accept fully how we are, then we're capable of radiating that kindness outside us. If we can't be kind to ourselves, then our kindness to other people is just a kind of sentiment, just an emotion that we generate, which doesn't really have a basis. If I hate myself, then I can't. If I don't really know what love is, if I don't love and appreciate my own life, then I can't really love others. That affection or kindness towards others becomes very superficial. It's just a kind of gloss that we paint upon the world around us. So when we talk about developing loving kindness, this means like a profound acceptance of our own life, our own character, our own conditioning. So no matter how ugly our habits might be, all the little kind of secret obsessions that we have that we never tell anyone else about, that wouldn't dream of making public, to be able to recognize those feelings of desire or aversion, the feelings of attachment, just for what they are, to not blame ourselves or hate ourselves for it. But when we talk about loving kindness, this means to accept, yeah, this too has its place in nature. This is not evil. This is just a quality of mind that is experienced here in my mind, as just as it's experienced in other people's minds as well, and that to acknowledge it in a very open and uncomplicated way. So we're not adding anything on to that. We just say, well, yeah, there is anger here, there is obsession, there is greed, there is jealousy, there is worry. You know, if we are a fearful type of person, and we worry a lot about everything, then we can blame ourselves for being I'm a failed Buddhist because I worry all the time. If I'm supposed to be meditating and being calm and tranquil, but all I do is worry, and you just finish one worry and then you create another one. And as soon as you get to the end of one problem, then you create another one. And I think all of us have had that feeling whereby you're if you're working around your home or your workplace, and you get to the end of some task, and then you get to the end of something and you sit down and suddenly there's nothing to do, and you haven't got anything to put the mind onto, and then you can watch the mind looking for something to get worried about. It starts to hunt. Have you ever seen that? Kind of, it looks around us to see what it is that I should be worrying about. I'm not fulfilling my responsibilities. I should be worried about something, because we get so used to it. We get so habituated to that feeling of anxiety, and that we feel we're not being responsible if we're not concerned and agitated, worried about things. So that when we talk about loving kindness, what this means is an open-hearted acceptance of all of these painful and negative attributes that we experience within ourselves. Not that we're saying, trying to make ourselves like worry, or like jealousy, or like fear, or selfishness. We're not pretending that these are good, or saying, well, actually, these are all wonderful things, and this is all part of nature, this is all the part of the wonderful tapestry of life. Jealousy and hatred and selfishness and greed, it's all part of life's drama. We're not pretending that it's all nice and good, but just to recognize this is the way things are. Acceptance means we're seeing the Dhamma, we're seeing the true reality of the situation, that whether we like it or not, whether it's good or bad, this is what's here, this wave of anxiety, or this wave of envy, or this wave of restlessness. That's what's here right now. Approval is saying, I like it. Yeah, this is what I like. But loving kindness, metta, does not mean approving of everything, but it means accepting, recognizing the reality. So this is why during this retreat I've mentioned this a few times, is that if there isn't this open-hearted quality as a basic attitude that we approach our efforts to train the mind, then all of our efforts will be distorted or will be wasted. Just trying to be good by suppressing the bad and hating the bad, or the unwholesome in us, we become more and more neurotic, actually. We just become a good producer. We're just trying to create goodness and niceness. And it's like covering everything over with sugar or pink paint. It creates a sweet veneer, a coating, a shell around everything. But inside there's a no real understanding of truth. There's a rejection and tension going on within us. So if we want to get to the bottom of our problems and our feelings of dissatisfaction, our lack of freedom in life, there has to be a profound understanding of what we mean by kindness, and then to learn to exercise that towards our own mind, to learn to accept the conditioning that we have as a woman, as a man, as a American, as a Thai, as English, as old, as young, as clever, as not clever, as a success, as a failure, to be able to recognize all of the different aspects of our life, and to see them as part of the natural order. Then, out of that openness, then there's an attunement to Dhamma, there's an attunement, a harmonization with the way things are, and then because of that, then our actions are guided by wisdom, by compassion, by kindness, by unselfishness. When we're guided by those qualities, then what we choose to follow is the good. We choose to follow that which is wholesome. We choose to not follow that which is unwholesome. So when we recognize here is anger, or here is jealousy, or here is lust, or greed, here is worry. Now, first of all, the habit might be very strong, just to immediately follow that, to immediately pursue a worry, to immediately pursue a feeling of fear or greed. But the more that we see it clearly, that this is greed, and we see the habit being followed, we also, with the same kind of clarity, we see the result of it. That yes, you can eat 15 mangoes, but it makes you ill for the rest of the week. That's what happens if you follow greed, or if you feel jealousy, you feel jealous of someone, and you find that you act upon that, then we witness the results of our actions. We see the result, the karmic result of what we do. And then in seeing the ugliness that comes from following unwholesome action, that comes home to us, and slowly the message sinks in, and the habit is weakened. Now, I don't just say this as kind of nice or Buddhist philosophy, but this is something that, that over the years of meditation practice and spiritual training that I've followed, I see very clearly that some habits are very, very difficult to break. But it's only when we accept them and acknowledge them for what they are that we actually transcend them. We get beyond them. If we don't accept them, we never get beyond them. We're always just caught in a feeling of hating ourselves, fearing the unwholesome qualities of mind. People used to ask Ajahn Chah how it was that he developed such a lot of wisdom, how he became so wise, because they said, you must have studied the Tripitaka for years and years to be such a wise person. He said, no, I haven't studied it very much at all. In fact, I'm pretty useless, really. I only studied for about the suttas for about the first 6 or 7 years of my monastic life. I haven't really looked at them for years. I said, how did you get to be so wise then? How do you know so much? And he said, because I had such enormous defilements. Because my problems were so huge. I had such an angry, lustful, restless, doubt-ridden mind that I had to learn about those things in order to get beyond them. And so that in the course of dealing with what we think of as our problems and our obstructions, that's actually what enables us to develop great wisdom. That these become like the fertilizer, like the weeds in your garden. They're not rubbish. You don't throw them away. If you compost them and you recycle them, then they become the best kind of fertilizer for your garden. In exactly the same way, all of the negativity, anxiety, fear, lust, greed, hatred, insecurity, selfishness that we experience, these are like the weeds of the mind. If we just pull them out with great kind of care and kindness, put them in the composting bin, pretty soon they're broken down and we can use them to fertilize the garden of our mind, the garden of our heart. Now, in the West, even though many people here have grown up in Thailand and have very much of an Asian background, still, again, as I was saying during the retreat, we're very much affected by the world around us. And in the West, there's an obsession with what they call the cult of the individual. That our own life and our own achievements, our own excellence is very important, and winning is very important to us as a culture. To be the best is extremely important. We have very much lost our group mentality. One thing that really impressed me when I went to live in Thailand in the northeast was the village life of people in the Isan, in the northeast of Thailand. Because what was such a strong contrast for me was that the needs of the village, the welfare of the village was the most important thing. And that you as an individual were less important than your family, and the family was less important than the village. So whatever the village needed, whatever was helpful for the village, that's what you would do, and that's what would be praised. That's what was valued, was what was helpful to the whole. And if you were particularly good at something, that goodness was only of value if you used those abilities to help other people. It wasn't just like an achievement or a value in itself. Now, here in the West, we tend to make personal excellence, my abilities and my capacities, we praise that as an end in itself. We make that the goal, for me to be best. And as I said a few times, even though we might think ourselves, and I certainly thought this way, well, I'm way beyond that sort of thing, I'm not a competitive type of person. That's not my nature, I'm a spiritual person. I'm not into competition. But you notice how even in the sitting meditation, that somehow you want to be sitting better than other people. That you notice who sits straightest, who doesn't move. Isn't it amazing that we become competitive even in our spiritual life? And it took me a long time to recognize this, but I was about 4 or 5 years in the monastery already before I suddenly realized that I wanted to be the best monk. I wanted, that was what I was. All of my ambitious tendencies, even though my brain was saying, "Oh, I'm a spiritual person now, and I don't care about competition," and all I want is oneness with everything, and to help all people and all living beings. I'm a Buddhist monk. This is what Buddhist monks do. Actually, underneath that, there was still the personality of a young child who wanted to be best at everything, who wanted to come top of the class, win all the races, and be praised by everyone, and for everyone else to look at me and say, "Ooh, isn't he good?" And it took me years to recognize this fact. Now that in itself is maybe harmless, because the work that you're doing is actually helping other people, and you are developing good qualities, you're developing mindfulness, and you're developing your skills in meditation and so on, so that it's not as though that you're becoming the best, sniper, or you're the best serial killer, or or the best acquisitive. You're the richest businessman on Wall Street, and you're kind of squashing people left and right to do that. But it took me a long time to realize that actually what was more important to me was being best, or being perfect. And there was a tremendous fear of failure. I couldn't stand. I was afraid of failing, or afraid of criticism. And anytime I did anything wrong, you'd feel like you were broken up into a million pieces inside. Anytime anyone sort of didn't praise me, or that said something critical about me, I began to notice that I was really worried about that, really afraid of that. And so that I began to see that even though on the surface here I was being a Buddhist monk and practicing meditation and dedicating my life to helping all living beings, actually all the living beings that I was supposed to be helping or saving were actually just like stooges, or kind of like a kind of insignificant in my personal development program. It's like I need an audience in order for me, like Dr. Wanshai put very well, you need to, if you want to be a teacher, you have to have an audience, right? You have to have students. So I realized that it wasn't a matter of helping other people that I was really interested in. I just like to say things that then caused others to say, "Oh, you're so helpful, this is so wonderful, you're such a marvelous monk." And I realized I didn't really care about them at all. I just wanted to score points off. I wanted them to enable me to score points, kind of good karma points. And you realize this is very much the way that we function as human beings. That we go into occupations or lifestyles, and they can be very benevolent and helpful, like being a doctor or a social worker. But it's amazing how, even though on the outside this is sort of labelled as helping other people, that it's actually can very often just be something that is me in pursuit of my career, making a name for myself. I remember I was talking about this with a group of Sri Lankan people who came to the monastery at Amaravati earlier this year, and most of the Sri Lankans in Britain are either engineers or doctors. And I just casually mentioned I was talking about the same subject, and I casually mentioned, it's very easy for someone to become a doctor and to be, helping people and and healing people and saving lives. But actually, all the way along, the people that they're helping and healing and saving are actually just kind of insignificant players in their need to be a doctor, because that's what the society has expected of them. They've been kind of told that this is a good thing to be, and that you should work hard at your occupation, and then you'll really be someone. You'll make a name for yourself. You have a position in the society. You'll be respected. And that I just sort of casually mentioned this, and you could see a few of the faces going, "Oh dear, oh dear, yes." And it's not a matter of blaming or criticizing anyone, but just having recognized that spiritual life and a spiritual resource for others, just the same way as a doctor or a social worker, then that very lifestyle can be what they say shanghaied, or kind of taken over by our personal needs to have an identity, to be praised, to have a good social status, to have people around us saying, "Yes, you're marvelous, you're good, you are a success, you are worth something." And that it's our insecurity and our need for personal perfection that is actually motivating us. So what I found that this was a very sobering realization that when I started to see this in myself, and I began to see how it wasn't that I felt, well, I shouldn't be a monk, but I began to see the identification that there was with the role of being, not just being a monk, but trying to be perfect. And that in the effort to try and be perfect and get it right all the time, underneath that there was this fear of failure. I realized I couldn't accept failure. I couldn't accept criticism. I couldn't accept, if people didn't like me. And I began to realize how important that is for us as human beings, to learn to know how to fail, to be able to fail. Particularly in the West, where failure is a terrible crime. You're a non-person. You're an imperfect. You're not really worth anything if we have failed. Now, this may not be true for many of you, but certainly this is I've experienced myself. And the last retreat I gave at Amaravati at Easter time, I just brought this up in one Dhamma talk on about the third or fourth day, and the whole of the rest of the retreat, people were asking me questions about failure, and it seemed to be a very common experience that we live in fear of failure, and somehow that's something that we don't recognize, because we assume that it was good to be successful all the time. It's obviously it's right to do your best, and it's bad to fail. It's good to succeed. But the problem is that we don't see those as relative judgments, or we don't see that the way of labeling something a success or labeling something as a failure is very relative. It depends on our point of view. What one day we can call a success, another day we recognize it. Well, that was the worst thing that ever happened to me. To get that contract, to get that job, that was a disaster. It's actually much more suitable. And he said it was an extraordinary realization that what was disappointed was just his ego, that his ego was not being pleased, not being pampered, and that actually maybe it was for the best that he didn't get the job. And he said, 3 years later, I now actually understand what being a bishop means. I had time to contemplate it. It's not just me achieving something, me getting up the ladder, but I actually understand it much more of a role of service, that you accept the invitation to do it rather than you use it as a sort of another notch on your gun, an achievement, sort of another little set of initials to put on your curriculum vitae, to say, look at me, aren't I wonderful? And that was a very interesting conversation, because this is exactly what I'd begun to recognize myself. And that and over the years I began to see that it's, if we can allow ourselves to fail, which means to recognize that we don't always get what we want, life doesn't always go the way that we like, and that it's not a matter of of that being somehow ultimately bad or wrong even. But to recognize that life is not under our control. We do the best we can, we work in the best way that we can. Sometimes the world praises us, sometimes we get praised without any real justification. We get praised for something that's really, there's no great effort from us, or that people get praise us for something very superficial. But we like that. We think, wow, what marvelous judgment they have. But if we get criticized for something, and criticized for something that we've done very well, but someone just has a negative point of view, we get really hurt and annoyed and resentful, and we start to justify ourselves. But if we can just act and do what we need to do our work the best way we can, and let the world make of it what it will, then we're free. And when I began to recognize about 7 or 8 years ago how afraid of failure I was, I began to not exactly deliberately make mistakes, but I began to stop seeking or trying to put myself in a position where I would get praise, or I would just leave things undone. I would stop trying to be the perfect monk, always doing everything better than everyone else. And it was incredibly hard to do. To just be not exactly casual, but just ready to be ordinary, to be normal. And it was funny that when at this time this realization was coming over me. I remember I used to do all kinds of ascetic practices, like I didn't lie down at all for about 3 years, and I used to very strictly eat 1 meal a day, and I was a very strict vegetarian, and had all kinds of little things I was doing, all sorts of little, I couldn't, and it was impossible for me to be normal. And I suddenly realized that I was doing all this stuff just to try and be special or different, perfect, and so I decided to give all this up, and I went to, and I've been looking at this as being, the way that the perfect monk should operate. And I remember going to Ajahn Sumedho just before the winter retreat one year and saying, I've decided to give up all my ascetic practices. And to my amazement, it's the only time I've ever seen him really lose his mindfulness. He was so happy. He said, at last, finally you got the point. And I'd never seen it, trying so hard to be kind of neurotically perfect, that he was absolutely delighted. He was sort of overjoyed that I could just be normal, just be an ordinary monk. And he told me a story of something that happened because he'd been through the same thing about 10, 15 years before. And when he was at Wat Pah Pong, and he'd been there about 2 or 3 years, and he was a real super ascetic monk. He really meant business. He was a real serious meditator. And Wat Pah Pong was not exactly a playground. It's a pretty tough place with the worst food in the world, which Ajahn Chah was very proud of. He says Wat Pah Pong has the worst food on planet Earth. And it's pretty near true. But Ajahn Sumedho was a real serious meditator. And he said there was this one particular monk that he used to look down upon as like, well, he's a kind of casual character, he doesn't really try very hard, he doesn't sit up late at night, and he's just a sort of ordinary monk, a sort of farm boy in robes. No one really special, not a real serious seeker like me. And then after one time, Ajahn Sumedho, he used to do a lot of fasting. And in our tradition, if you want to fast, then you have to ask the teacher permission. If you want to go without food, you have to ask the teacher's permission. So one time Ajahn Sumedho went to Ajahn Chah and said, I'd like to, for the next 6 weeks or a couple of months, I'd like to just eat every other day. Just eat one day and then not eat the next, so that I have more time to meditate. And Ajahn Chah, in his own way, just very casually pointed to this other particular monk who Ajahn Sumedho looked upon as this sort of average farm boy type. Said, well, you can if you want to, but he doesn't need to do those sort of things. He's like, but. And that was the end of conversation. Ajahn Chah kind of just turned away and walked off, and just left, as he was very capable of doing. He just leave you there, just hanging in midair. But it really stuck in Ajahn Sumedho's mind. It's like, he doesn't need to do those sort of things. So Ajahn Chah is holding up this other monk, who I think is just kind of normal and average. He's holding him up as an example for me. And I'm being the super ascetic. I'm doing it all right. I'm really trying hard. But he's praising that one against what I'm doing. He doesn't need to do those things. And that was when he had the insight into just doing what you do, being normal, not fearing being ordinary. Now, I'm not saying that we should be casual about our life, or just not try hard, or not put what effort we can into using our abilities, but to start to witness that fear, that lack of acceptance for our own nature. That if we are able to recognize our limitations, then we're not neurotically trying to be someone or be perfect just for out of our own insecurity. If we can have kindness, acceptance towards the way life is, we don't have to hide our imperfections. We don't have to hide our weaknesses. We don't have to pretend they're not there. And as I found with Ajahn Sumedho, when you actually do that, the people around you are a lot more relieved. It's a blessing for everyone around you. You think, oh, thank goodness for that. You know. And that rather than being a wonderful example to people, you're driving them nuts with your perfectionism. Now, there's a strange transformation that actually happens, because what we look upon as being imperfect. There's a beautiful line in the verses of the third Zen patriarch called the Sin Sin Ming, where it says to live in the true way, to live according to the true path, is to be without anxiety about non-perfection. So when we meet with the imperfect, either in ourselves or in people around us, if we refrain from getting anxious and upset about that, then we find ourselves at that very moment, we're on the path. As soon as we meet with the imperfect and we think, oh, that's bad, it shouldn't be that way, and I shouldn't be like this, and they shouldn't be like that, then we're not on the path. This is called righteous views rather than right view. Do you understand that? To be righteous is like, this is wrong, this shouldn't be this way. It's a state of tension and suffering. Even if you're correct, even if someone shouldn't be selfish or greedy or unkind, even if you shouldn't be, you could have done a more perfect job. Righteousness has that kind of anxious superiority to it. Righteous views are not the same as right view. Right view is when we recognize, well, this is the way things are. This is the way this person is. It's not necessarily good the way I am. Maybe it could have been done better. But this is the way things are. We refrain from getting anxious, and then suddenly, to our amazement, what we were looking at as imperfect, we suddenly recognize as perfect in its own right. There's a strange transformation comes about. Now, I don't say this just for you to believe, but just to witness for yourself. When you see something wrong about yourself, when you see something wrong about other people or about the world, if we just look at that and reflect on it and consider, well, right or wrong, this is the way it is. Like I've been saying, just to recognize this is a worry. This is a feeling of desire. It comes, it goes. In that recognition, suddenly something that felt wrong changes into being the way nature is. And then out of that clarity, then we can pursue a good path. There's to give another illustration, there's a famous story. This actually took place in Japan. It was an English man who was living in a Zen monastery in Japan, and he was given the job of it was autumn time, and he was given the job of raking the leaves in the garden. Now, Japanese gardens are all very complicated. They have little pathways and lawns and rockeries and moss, and this man was given a rake and told to rake all of the fallen leaves off the garden. And so he took his rake, and all afternoon, 4 or 5 hours, he spent very, very carefully raking all the leaves and being incredibly mindful, excruciatingly mindful. Every leaf, his mind was concentrated on every movement of the rake. So he left beautiful patterns in the grass, and then very careful of the moss, and didn't harm anything. And finally, after 4 or 5 hours of doing this, everything was completely spick and span. Not a leaf in sight. He'd rake them all up and carry them away, and it looked absolutely beautiful, perfectly clean. And as always happens in these stories, this is the moment when the abbot came by. The Zen master walks through the garden, and the Englishman is just finishing, and he's standing there with his rake, and he's thinking, well, right, he's going to see this, and he's just going to see this, the mindfulness just radiating off the garden, just soaked with my pure awareness and attention I put into this. And the Zen master came in the garden and looked around him, and the Englishman is just sort of waiting for his recognition to come, and the master says, "Not quite perfect." What does he mean? What do you mean, not quite perfect? And so he manages to contain his annoyance and says, "Venerable Master, how do you mean, not quite perfect?" And with that, the master reached out and put his hand around the trunk of a maple tree just nearby, a young tree, gave it a shake, and then about 6 leaves, red leaves, kind of dropped down and landed on the grass. And he says, "Now it's perfect." What that means is that we should always make an allowance, like to have that flexibility. They also have the expression 80% is perfect. If you're an air traffic controller in Chicago airport, don't don't follow this advice, but generally speaking, in normal things, 80% is perfect, which means that we aim to have life good enough. That it's not, and I'm not advocating being lazy or casual, but just so that we're not in a constant state of stress. Because if we try for 100%, all we do is fail. It's never enough. We're never quite there. But if we say to ourselves, well, 80% is perfect, then that means that we can work with a relaxed mind. Our heart is at ease, and we do what we can do. And we realize it's good enough. If it has to be 100%, we never get anywhere. We're always trying too hard, and our very trying gets in the way. We fall over our own feet. Now, I think everyone has experienced this kind of thing. When you try too hard, you try so hard, you mess up the very thing that you're trying to do. It's like you might know how to do some job, you might have done it 1,000 times. Or like Dr. Wanchai was saying, when you're treating a monk, suddenly it really matters. And some little treatment that you've done 1,000 times, and you can do it with your eyes closed, suddenly because it matters, you get it all wrong. You stitch them up the wrong way, or you forget to tie the knots, or you make a stupid mistake because you're trying too hard. So this is what this 80% is perfect means: to try, but not to over-try. Someone I was talking with yesterday, a Burmese lady who comes and helps here, she was saying that this monk that she used to support in Burma was very keen on setting up a Buddhist center over here in America. But whilst he was in Burma, he worked out exactly what was needed, exactly the place, exactly the kind of buildings, exactly the kind of committee that was required, exactly the rules that everyone had to follow, and he had the whole thing figured out. And all he needed was the people and the money and the place that would follow his plan. And of course he got over here, and there was 6 other people who were equally committed with the same teacher, the same tradition, all wanted, yes, we must develop a center, a good meditation center. But their ideas were slightly different. And they couldn't agree. And they had a lot of money and a lot of energy, but they couldn't agree, so nothing happened. Still hasn't happened. This was 5-6 years ago. Because the idea of what is perfect, what we need, is obstructing the reality of the situation. So that if we work with what is good enough, then we can work with life. We are at ease, we work with a relaxed mind, and we can work effectively. If we try too hard, if we overdo it, if we're too idealistic, we disable ourselves. We become it becomes hard for us to do anything properly. So this is a way that we can be clear about our life. We can say, with that relaxed attitude, we can witness what's the priorities for us. We can see the context of what we're doing, why we are working, why are we doing this thing in the first place. Some task that we put our mind on, we can be so busy getting it right that we forget why we're doing it in the first place. Why are we interested in becoming a doctor? Why are we interested in meditation practice? Why are we interested in Buddhism? You can become such a kind of professional meditator, so keen on following your breath, that you forget that you're doing it in order to be peaceful. You're sitting there with your teeth clenched, strangling your impulses and and becoming a serious meditator and making yourself miserable. And the only reason why we're doing it in the first place is to realize peacefulness, wisdom, calm, freedom. So we apply effort, but we need to recognize, why are we doing this? What's the point? And as Dr. Wanchai was saying also, and I was bringing up yesterday, to ask ourselves, what are we doing this for? Where are we going? And we don't say this just to kind of be threatening, like, you're going to die, so better wise up quickly. It's not a matter of threatening ourselves with punishment, but the reason why we contemplate, who are we? What is life? Where are we going? We ask ourselves those questions because the body's going to die, because we get distracted with secondary things. And it's not that we're trying to threaten ourselves or make life difficult, but we're just trying to see the priorities and see the reality of things. So that when I ask myself, where am I going? What that reveals to me is, where do I think I'm going? That if I ask that question, then it makes it clear that I tend to think there's a me, a person, who is traveling through time, who is going places, who is doing things. And when I see that, I realize that that's only a half-truth. That in reality, the true reality of things, the Dhamma is never going anywhere. It's timeless. It's here, now. And that the impression of me going somewhere, me going from birth to death, me going from Chicago to Detroit, to England, to Thailand, or wherever, those are only relative, superficial truths. And that the reality is that there's no one going anywhere. The truth is here, now, that we can awaken to. That's why, like at the end of the chant on loving kindness, and oftentimes people don't really notice this or really figure out what it's about. You have the whole sutta talking about kindness to all other living beings, like to have the kindness that a mother would have to her only child. For all living beings, the beautiful and the ugly. But then the very last verse, if you noticed, it says, by not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desire, is not born again into this world. Now that's a funny thing to have at the end of a teaching on kindness, isn't it? It's like the last 4 lines, suddenly it's a different teaching altogether, it seems. But actually the greatest kindness is to let go of identification with the world, with other beings. It's like saying, yes, we should have kindness to other beings and undiscriminating benevolence to other beings. But the greatest kindness is to realize that there's nobody here and there's nobody there. And this is like the perfection of the teaching, or the fulfillment of the Buddha's teaching, is the realization of selflessness, not being born, not attaching to time and place. So that, as I was saying, this morning during the sitting, if you imagine at the end of any meditation sitting that the bell that we hear is like the last moment of our life. If the ringing of the bell, if that's the last moment of our life, what are we going to do with the next half hour? What are we hanging on to when the bell goes, and how quickly can we drop it? I've often done this as an exercise. It's like, can you drop everything before the sound of the bell fades away? You have a few seconds between when the bell rings and when the sound fades. Can we really drop our identification with everything before the sound fades? It's a good exercise to do. And again, not to intimidate ourselves, but to recognize the priorities in life and to see the need, the urgency that there is to recognize our attachments and to be able to let go. And this is the greatest kindness, this is the greatest blessing of our life, to be able to drop everything, to let go of everything, to stop the identification with everything. And then from that spaciousness, that openness, then all goodness, all kindness flows. So I will finish there for this morning and offer these thoughts for you all to consider. I think it's, meditation helps a lot to make it clear what your motivation is. Because we find ourselves working hard or studying, and we forget why we're doing it. And so that if we can remember what our motivation is, and to take time to put things down, that we tend to think that that to work hard is good, therefore to work harder is better. But then we can work so hard that we disable ourselves from doing anything at all. So what is for guiding our children and our families and our fellow workers, it's very helpful, just if you are in a position of authority or able to guide, is just to pull them out of their situation, to just say, okay, we're going off for the weekend, or let's go to the movie, or to create situations where you're giving a contrast, some way where you can just switch off, where they can put their books and they're outside of the work situation, so that you're creating more space in that way. Because if it's left up to us, if we're really obsessed with something, every minute of the day will get filled with it. And so then that's when our friends, our spiritual friends and our guides can come in and say, you need a break. Come on, let's go off and do something. So it's and even though during that time that they might be worrying and think, oh, I should be back on my books, or I'm losing money, I'm wasting money being out here for the weekend. That's just the worrying mind, and actually the being outside of that situation, being in having a contrast really does make a difference. But often we can't see it for ourselves, so then it takes our friends around us to say, you really need a break. Come on, let's go. Just go for a drive. Go to Canada, or to drive to Mexico. Do something that is to take a person out of their normal situation, and then you find that people will begin to see for themselves how lost they have become in the importance of their own thing. And particularly with young people, like when you're a student, it can be, that's why you find so many people like hurting themselves or committing suicide in universities, because the exams become the most important thing in the world. And so from outside you can say, well, it's only a degree, no big deal, don't worry about it. But when you're in it, if you don't have a perspective, it's the whole world, it's everything that's meaningful and important. So if people are interested in meditation, then that's the most helpful, because then you can begin to see that obsession and your motivation for yourself. But if they're not interested in meditation, then to just create ways that you pull them out of that environment. And it's also probably be good for you as well to give oneself a break, to put your own life into a different context. I certainly find that extremely helpful. Living in Amaravati, I have a lot of responsibilities there, teaching and administration and so on. And it's amazing the effect of just going down to, say, Chithurst Monastery down in Sussex for a couple of days, or going off to visit my mother or something. It's like, oh, suddenly it all falls into a different perspective.
But sometimes we're not that fortunate. We have children who are not interested in studying or doing any work.